What if the silence you lived in your entire life wasn't a tragic birth defect, but a multi-million-dollar betrayal? Leo Russo, the brooding heir to a ruthless crime syndicate, believed he was born deaf, that is, until a new maid handed him an object that shattered his silent world forever. To be the heir of the Russo crime syndicate meant possessing a heart of ice and eyes that missed nothing. Leo Russo had both, but he lacked the one thing his father, Dominic Russo, believed was essential for survival in their brutal world: the ability to hear a lie. Leo was born into complete, impenetrable silence. While his father built an empire on whispered threats, backroom deals, and the loud, violent crack of firearms, Leo existed in a vacuum. He felt the low, thrumming vibration of a heavy oak door slamming. He felt the sharp, sudden tremor in the floorboards when a man's body hit the ground. But he had never heard the sound of his own name. Because of this, the syndicate viewed him not as a prince, but as a liability. The Russo estate, a sprawling, fortified stone mansion, isolated on the jagged cliffs of Rhode Island, was a fortress of secrets. It was here that Clara Hayes arrived on a damp Tuesday morning, clutching a modest duffel bag and a fabricated resume. Clara wasn't a typical maid. She was 24, possessed a razor-sharp intellect, and carried a deeply buried vendetta that tied her directly to the Russo family bloodline. Her hiring had been standard procedure. The estate had a high turnover rate for domestic staff. Working for a mafia boss meant seeing things you shouldn't and leaving before you were forced to stay forever. Clara had been interviewed by Mrs. Gable, a stern woman with a face like carved granite, who gave her one cardinal rule: you clean, you serve, and you never, ever make direct eye contact with the boss's son. Clara's first glimpse of Leo Russo was 3 days into her employment. She was dusting the expansive, dark-wood library when the heavy double doors flew open. Leo stormed in. He was a striking man in his late 20s, tall and powerfully built, with dark, messy hair and a sharp, aristocratic jawline shadowed by stubble. But it was his eyes that caught Clara off guard. They were a piercing, stormy grey, burning with a furious, trapped energy. Following closely behind him was his uncle, Vincent Russo, the syndicate's underboss. Vincent was a man who smiled with his mouth but never with his eyes. As Leo paced the room like a caged tiger, Vincent spoke to him through an interpreter, a nervous-looking man named Alex. Clara kept her head down, continuing to polish a brass globe, but she watched their reflection in the large bay window. Vincent was speaking rapidly, his face a mask of feigned sympathy. Tell my nephew that the shipping ports in Brooklyn are no longer his concern. Tell him the family council has decided he lacks the situational awareness to manage the docks. Alex, the interpreter, turned to Leo and began signing. Clara's hands paused on the brass globe. Her younger sister was deaf. Clara had been fluent in American Sign Language since she was a child. She watched Alex's hands carefully. Alex did not sign what Vincent had said. Instead, Alex signed, "Your uncle says the Port Authority is investigating the docks. He is taking over temporarily to protect you from the police." Clara's breath hitched. They were lying to him. His own family was manipulating his isolation, feeding him a sanitized, altered version of reality. Leo stood rigid, his chest heaving slightly. He stared at Alex, then at his uncle Vincent. For a split second, Clara saw a flash of profound loneliness in Leo's eyes. He nodded once, sharply, and turned his back on them, dismissing them from the room. Once Vincent and the interpreter were gone, Leo grabbed a heavy crystal whiskey decanter from a side table and hurled it against the stone fireplace. It shattered violently, sending shards of glass flying across the Persian rug. Clara flinched at the crash, dropping her polishing cloth. Leo spun around, his eyes locking onto her. He hadn't known she was there. The air in the room grew instantly heavy. charged with a dangerous, suffocating tension. He took a slow, deliberate step toward her. "Mrs." Gable's warning echoed in Clara's mind, never make direct eye contact. But Clara didn't look away, as the formidable Mafia heir loomed over her, radiating anger and intimidation. Clara did something that no one in his violent, sycophantic world had ever done. She calmly raised her hands. "The glass is sharp. Let me clean it before you step on it," she signed, her movements fluid and precise. Leo froze. The raw fury in his eyes dissolved into absolute shock. He stared at her hands, then up to her face, his gaze stripping her down to her soul. In his 27 years, none of the staff had ever spoken his language. They looked at him with pity, fear, or contempt. But this girl with the quiet eyes and the dusty apron was looking at him as an equal. He slowly raised his hands, his long fingers moving with a rough, masculine grace. "Who are you?" "Clara. I'm the new maid," she signed back. Leo stepped closer, his imposing frame casting a shadow over her. He reached out, his thumb gently catching her chin, tilting her face up to study her features. His touch was surprisingly warm, sending a jolt of electricity down her spine. "You shouldn't be here, Clara." He signed with one hand, his eyes darkening. "This house ruins everything good." Over the next 3 weeks, a secret, unspoken alliance formed between the Mafia heir and the new maid. To the rest of the household, Clara was invisible. Just another uniform scrubbing marble floors and serving espresso. But in the shadows of the estate, in the dimly lit corridors after midnight, in the corners of the vast greenhouse, and in the sanctuary of Leo's private quarters, they communicated. Clara became his true ears, through scribbled notes hidden in his laundry, and quick, discreet signs passed across crowded dining rooms. She told him the truth. She revealed that his father's capos were siphoning money from the family casinos. She told him that his uncle Vincent was holding private meetings with a rival cartel from Chicago. Leo was brilliant. Once armed with the truth, his strategic mind went to work. He began moving chess pieces in the dark, intercepting shipments, and outmaneuvering his uncle's men without ever saying a word. The syndicate was baffled. They thought the deaf prince was blind to their schemes. But suddenly, he was always 3 steps ahead, and as they worked together, the line between master and servant began to blur. There were moments of quiet intimacy that made Clara's heart race the way Leo would watch her lips when she absent-mindedly hummed, fascinated by the vibration of her throat. The way he would pull her into the alcoves of the mansion just to breathe in the scent of vanilla and soap on her skin. He was fiercely protective, positioning himself between her and his father's brutal enforcers whenever they walked through the halls. But Clara's presence in the Russo estate wasn't a coincidence, and her affection for Leo was complicating her true mission. Clara's father had been Dr. William Hayes, a brilliant otolaryngologist and neurologist. 10 years ago, he had been coerced into working for the Russo family. He died under highly suspicious circumstances, his car plunging off a cliff. Just days after he told Clara, he had made a terrifying discovery about the boss's son. Clara had infiltrated the estate to find her father's missing medical journals, to find proof of why he was murdered. Her breakthrough happened during a lavish gala hosted at the estate. While the family and their associates were downstairs drinking champagne and discussing blood money, Clara slipped into the restricted West Wing. She bypassed the security lock on Uncle Vincent's private study, a skill her desperate past had taught her. She systematically searched the mahogany desk, finding nothing but ledgers and blackmail material. Frustrated, she moved to a heavy floor safe. She knew Vincent's obsession with dates. She punched in the anniversary of his brother's ascension to the head of the family. The safe clicked open. Inside, beneath stacks of bearer bonds, she found a dusty black leather journal. Her father's initials, W.H., were embossed on the cover. Clara's hands shook as she opened it. She flipped through pages of complex medical jargon until she reached the final entry. dated exactly 10 years ago. Subject: L. Russo. The boy's deafness is not congenital. His auditory nerve is perfectly intact. His eardrums are severely scarred, presenting as profound deafness. But the inner ear architecture is flawless. He is not naturally deaf. He has been systematically exposed to a synthesized neurotoxin, likely slipped into his food since infancy, designed to paralyze the auditory cilia. If the toxin is stopped and bypassed with bone conduction oscillation, he could hear. Vincent knows. I told Vincent today. God help me. I shouldn't have. Clara clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a gasp. Leo wasn't born deaf. He was poisoned, robbed of music, of voices, of his own life, so that his uncle Vincent could eventually claim the empire without a strong heir in the way. Clara shoved the journal into her apron and grabbed a small, sleek metallic device wrapped in velvet sitting next to the book in the safe. It was a prototype her father had been building, an advanced, high-frequency bone conduction transducer. She sprinted out of the study, her heart hammering against her ribs, and ran straight up the servants' staircase to Leo's private suite. She burst into his room. Leo was standing by the window, a glass of scotch in his hand, staring out at the dark ocean. He turned, surprised by her sudden, frantic intrusion. He immediately set the glass down and crossed the room, his hands moving quickly. "Clara, what's wrong? Are you hurt?" Clara was panting, tears streaming down her face. She didn't sign back. She walked up to him, trembling, and pulled the black journal from her apron, pressing it into his chest. Leo frowned in confusion. He looked at the journal, opening it to the marked page. Clara watched his eyes dart across her father's handwriting. She watched the color completely drain from his face. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The silence he had been trapped in wasn't fate. It was a prison built by his own blood. His breathing turned ragged. A devastating, terrifying rage began to radiate from him, so intense it made the air in the room feel thin. He looked at Clara, his grey eyes shining with an unspeakable agony. Before he could pull away and destroy the room, Clara reached into her pocket. She pulled out the silver, crescent-shaped transducer. She stepped into his space, her hands gently framing his face. She pressed the cool metal device firmly against the mastoid bone directly behind his right ear. She reached into her pocket with her other hand, pulling out her phone, and connected it via a wire to the device. She pressed play on a voice recording app. Leo's eyes widened in absolute terror and shock. His knees buckled slightly, and he grabbed Clara's waist to steady himself. For the first time in 27 years, the silence broke. It wasn't a sound through his ears, but a deep, resonant vibration that bypassed his damaged eardrums and shot straight into his brain, translating into clear, undeniable audio. Through the device, vibrating into his skull, he heard Clara's actual voice, soft and trembling, speaking into the microphone. "My name is Clara." Her voice echoed in his mind, rich and melodic. "And we are going to destroy them for what they did to you." Leo collapsed to his knees, pulling Clara down with him, burying his face in her neck as the first sob he had ever heard tore from his own throat. For a man who had existed entirely in a void, the sudden introduction of sound was both a miracle and an agony. In the safety of Leo's fortified bedroom, the world rushed in like a tidal wave. Through the small, crescent-shaped transducer pressed against his mastoid bone, the universe was no longer a silent movie. It was violently alive. He felt the heavy, rhythmic thud of his own heartbeat. He heard the haunting, hollow whistle of the ocean wind rattling the reinforced window panes. But most intoxicating of all was the sound of Clara. They spent the next 3 nights in absolute secrecy, engaging in a frantic, exhausting crash course in audio processing. Leo possessed a genius-level intellect, honed by years of hypervigilance. He already knew the structure of language. He had been a master lip reader since childhood, analyzing the precise shape of syllables and vowels. Now, Clara provided the missing cipher. She sat across from him on the edge of his massive four-poster bed, speaking slowly, while simultaneously signing the words, allowing his brain to stitch the mechanical vibrations of her voice to the visual language he knew. "My name is Clara," she whispered, her hands moving in tandem. Leo closed his eyes. His jaw clenched as he absorbed the warm, melodic vibration of her voice echoing through his skull. He opened his eyes and reached out, his large, calloused hand gently tracing the curve of her throat, feeling the vocal cords vibrate beneath his fingertips. He matched the physical sensation to the sound in his head. "Your voice." He signed slowly with his free hand. His stormy grey eyes locked onto hers. "It feels like warmth, like whiskey, burning in the chest. It is beautiful." Clara's breath hitched, a blush creeping up her neck. The sheer intensity of his focus was paralyzing. "We have to be careful, Leo," she murmured, leaning into his touch before pulling back to maintain her focus. "If Vincent figures out you can hear, he won't just take the device. He'll kill us both. You have to maintain the facade. You have to endure the silence, even when the noise is deafening." The ultimate test of his new reality came 2 days later, during the monthly family syndicate dinner. The dining hall was a cavernous room of imported Italian marble and dark mahogany, dominated by a massive 20-foot table. Dominic Russo, Leo's father and the undisputed boss of the East Coast, sat at the head. He was a frightening, aging lion of a man, his face scarred by decades of gangland wars. To his right sat Uncle Vincent, nursing a glass of Chianti, his smile as polished and fake as a porcelain doll. Leo sat to his father's left, wearing a bespoke black suit, his face an impenetrable mask of stoic indifference. Hidden beneath the thick, dark hair curling behind his right ear was the transducer, switched on and vibrating with the terrifying symphony of his family's deception. Clara stood in the periphery, dressed in her crisp maid's uniform, holding a silver pitcher of ice water. She watched Leo anxiously, praying he wouldn't break character. The sensory overload was staggering. Leo heard the clatter of silverware scraping against fine china, a sound that made his teeth ache. He heard the heavy, wet breathing of Lorenzo, Vincent's hulking chief enforcer, standing by the doorway. And for the first time in his life, he heard his father's voice. Dominic's voice was a deep, gravelly baritone, commanding and exhausted. "The federal heat on the Brooklyn ports is getting worse," Dominic growled, slamming a heavy fist on the table. "I need those shipping crates moved tonight. Alex, tell my son he is to stay at the estate. I don't want him caught in the crossfire if the feds raid the docks." Alex, the sweaty, nervous interpreter, turned to Leo. His hands moved in fluid ASL. "Your father says the business is struggling. He wants you to stay in your room tonight and read the ledgers." Beneath the table, Leo's hands curled into fists, so tight his knuckles turned bone white. The betrayal was physically nauseating. His father was trying to protect him, but Alex paid off. Vincent was manipulating the translation to make Dominic seem dismissive and cruel. Then, Leo heard something that chilled the blood in his veins. Vincent leaned slightly to his left, whispering out of the corner of his mouth to Lorenzo, while pretending to wipe his lips with a linen napkin. To anyone else, it would have been an inaudible murmur. But through the high-frequency amplifier of Clara's device, the words vibrated sharply into Leo's skull. "The old man is going to the docks tonight to oversee the transfer," Vincent whispered, his voice dripping with venom. "Pull the security detail at midnight. We hit Dominic at Pier 44. Make sure it looks like the Chicago cartel did it. Tomorrow, I become the boss, and my deaf, useless nephew gets a bullet in his sleep." Leo didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He calmly reached for his crystal water glass and took a slow sip. He felt Clara's eyes burning into him from the corner of the room. He set the glass down, turned his head slightly, and gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod. The trap is set. When the dinner concluded, Leo retreated to his study, slamming the heavy oak doors shut and locking them. Minutes later, Clara slipped in through the secret servant's passageway behind the bookshelves. As soon as she was clear, Leo ripped the device from behind his ear, pacing the room with a lethal, explosive energy. He switched to sign language, his hands moving with furious speed. Tonight. Midnight at Pier 44. Vincent is pulling my father's security detail. They are going to assassinate my father and frame Chicago. Then they are coming for me. Clara went pale. We have to warn Dominic. We have to tell him what Vincent is doing. Leo stopped, shaking his head sharply. No. My father won't believe it. Vincent is his brother. His most trusted advisor. If I try to warn him through a maid, or by suddenly revealing I can hear via a stolen prototype, Vincent will spin it. He will say we are crazy. Or that Chicago planted us. We need irrefutable proof. We need to catch them in the act. He walked over to his mahogany desk, opening a concealed drawer. He pulled out a matte black Glock 19, expertly checking the magazine and racking the slide. He looked up at Clara, his stormy eyes softening as he took in her terrified expression. He walked to her, holstering the weapon at the small of his back, and gently took her face in his hands. He pressed the device back against his skull. I am going to the docks, Leo spoke. It was the first time Clara had ever heard his voice. Because he was deaf his whole life, his speech was rough, gravelly, and slightly unpolished. But the sheer, raw masculinity of it sent a shiver down her spine. I will protect my father. You get out of this house. Go to the safe house in Vermont. We talked about this. Clara shook her head stubbornly, tears welling in her eyes. I'm not leaving you, Leo. Vincent's men are everywhere. I'm staying here to monitor the estate's security feeds. I can text you their movements. It's too dangerous, Leo growled, his accent thick and unfamiliar on his own tongue. My father died because of this family, Clara fired back, grabbing his lapels. I am not losing you too. Go, save your father. I'll be the eyes in the sky. Pier 44 was a desolate stretch of cracked concrete, jutting out into the icy black waters of the Atlantic. At 11:45 p.m., the freezing fog was thick, obscuring the towering stacks of metal shipping containers. Dominic Rousseau stood by his armored SUV, the collar of his wool overcoat turned up against the biting wind. He was accompanied by only 3 men. Vincent had insisted on a low profile to avoid federal detection, a fatal lie that Dominic had swallowed completely. Hidden atop a rusted crane 50 yards away, Leo watched through the scope of a suppressed sniper rifle. He had bypassed his own estate's security and beaten his father's convoy to the docks. He was dressed in tactical black, completely invisible in the night. The transducer pulsed against his bone, feeding him the ambient sounds of the harbor, the lapping waves, the creak of the metal containers, and the low murmur of his father's voice. Then he heard it. The subtle, deadly sound of a suppressed weapon being cocked. It wasn't coming from the street, it was coming from the shadows of the containers surrounding Dominic. Leo's phone buzzed in his pocket, a text from Clara. 3 black vans approaching the east gate. They bypassed the perimeter alarms. Lorenzo is leading them. Leo adjusted his scope. He saw Lorenzo stepping out from behind a massive red container, raising an assault rifle, aiming directly at the back of Dominic's head. Dominic didn't see him. His 3 guards were looking the wrong way. Leo didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed into his shoulder. 50 yards away, Lorenzo's rifle shattered in his hands as Leo's bullet tore through the receiver, sending sparks and shrapnel flying. Lorenzo screamed, dropping to his knees. Chaos erupted on the pier. Dominic's guards drew their weapons, screaming orders, but they were instantly pinned down by a barrage of automatic gunfire from Vincent's hit squad emerging from the fog. Leo abandoned the rifle, drawing his Glock. and began a rapid, lethal descent down the crane's ladder. He moved with the terrifying grace of an apex predator. For years, the syndicate thought his deafness made him slow, unaware of his surroundings. They didn't know that his lack of hearing had forced him to develop a spatial awareness that bordered on the supernatural. Now, armed with sound, he was a god of war. He hit the ground running. He heard the crunch of combat boots on gravel behind a stack of crates. He didn't even look. He pivoted and fired twice through the gap. Hearing the wet thud of two bodies hitting the pavement, he moved through the maze of containers, a silent shadow executing Vincent's men with ruthless, terrifying precision. He anticipated their movements before they made them, listening to their panicked whispers over their radios. "Where is the sniper? We're getting slaughtered out here." A voice crackled from a dropped walkie-talkie on the ground. Leo emerged from the fog, right behind his father's SUV. Dominic was crouched behind the engine block, bleeding from a graze on his shoulder, firing his revolver blindly into the mist. He turned, his eyes widening in absolute shock as he saw his deaf son standing in the crossfire. "Leo, what the hell are you doing here?" Dominic roared. Leo didn't have time to sign, nor did he have time to speak. He heard the metallic clink of a grenade pin being pulled from the roof of the warehouse to their left. He lunged forward, tackling his father to the ground. Just as the explosive detonated, showering the SUV in shrapnel and fire, the blast deafened the natural ears of everyone on the pier, but Leo's transducer bypassed his eardrums. He was the only one who could hear the footsteps of the remaining assassins retreating. The ambush was broken. They had failed. Sirens wailed in the distance. The real police were finally arriving. Leo hauled his father up by his coat. Dominic was staring at his son as if looking at a ghost. He had seen Leo react to the pin, pulling a sound impossible for a deaf man to perceive. "You," Dominic coughed, clutching his bleeding arm. "How did you know?" "How did you?" Leo met his father's eyes. "Vincent sent them." Leo signed quickly, his face a mask of cold fury. "We need to leave. Now." Back at the Russo estate, the atmosphere was suffocating. Vincent stood in the estate's high-tech security room, staring at the monitors. His face was a twisted mask of rage and panic. Lorenzo had just called him from a burner phone, screaming that the hit was a disaster and that Leo was there, fighting like a demon. "It's impossible." Vincent hissed to Alex, who was shaking like a leaf. "The boy is deaf. He couldn't have known about the hit. He couldn't have navigated the crossfire." Vincent leaned closer to the monitor, reviewing the footage of the estate's internal cameras from earlier that evening. He pulled up the tape of the dining room during dinner. He zoomed in on Leo. He watched his nephew sit in silence. But then, Vincent noticed something he had missed before. He saw Leo take a sip of water, look toward the corner of the room, and give a tiny, deliberate nod. Vincent rewound the tape, switching camera angles to see who Leo was looking at. The camera cut to Clara, the quiet, invisible maid, staring back at him. Vincent's blood ran cold. He pulled up the logs for the estate's secure server room. There was an unauthorized login 30 minutes ago. Someone was monitoring the external cameras at the docks. "The maid," Vincent whispered, a dark, sinister smile spreading across his face. "It's the maid. She's his handler. She's his ears." Vincent turned to Alex, drawing a silver revolver from his shoulder holster. "Find the girl. Bring her to the basement." 30 minutes later, Leo kicked open the back doors of the estate, carrying his wounded father into the grand foyer. He handed Dominic off to the loyal houseguards, screaming for the estate doctor. Leo didn't wait. He sprinted up the grand staircase, taking the steps 3 at a time. His heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The house was too quiet. He burst into the servants' quarters, kicking the door to Clara's room off its hinges. The room was destroyed. The mattress was flipped, the lamp was shattered, and the window was cracked. Her duffel bag was gone. "Clara!" Leo screamed, his rough voice tearing through his throat. Silence answered him. Then, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He ripped it out. It was a video message from an unknown number. Leo hit play. The audio vibrated through his skull, turning his blood to ice. It was a video of Clara, tied to a metal chair in a dark, concrete room. Her lip was split and bleeding, but her eyes were defiant. The camera panned to show Vincent standing behind her, holding a heavy iron wrench. He looked directly into the lens. "I don't know how you're hearing this, nephew." Vincent sneered, his voice dripping with sadistic glee. "But I know you're not deaf anymore. And I know this little rat is the reason why. You have 1 hour to come to the old slaughterhouse on 9th Avenue alone. If you bring your father, or if you bring men, I will start breaking her bones. Starting with the hands she uses to talk to you." The video ended. Leo stood in the ruined room, the phone cracking under the pressure of his grip. The symphony of the world faded away, replaced by a single, deafening frequency in his mind. Revenge. The rain battered the rusted tin roof of the abandoned meatpacking plant off 9th Avenue in Providence, Rhode Island. The building was a decaying monolith of brick and iron, reeking of old blood and salt water. Leo Russo parked his matte black Dodge Charger a block away, stepping into the torrential downpour. He didn't bring an army. He brought the one advantage his family had denied him his entire life: the element of sound, pressed firmly against the bone behind his ear. The advanced prototype developed by Clara's father, based on classified acoustic research from Johns Hopkins Neurology, was cranked to its maximum frequency. As Leo approached the heavy steel loading doors, the world inside the slaughterhouse unspooled in his mind like a high-definition audio map. He heard the steady, agonizing drip, drip, drip of a leaky pipe. He heard the heavy, nervous pacing of 2 armed guards near the catwalks, and then he heard the jagged, shallow breathing of Clara. Leo slipped through a side service entrance, his Glock 19 suppressed and ready. He moved through the shadows of the hanging meat hooks, his footsteps completely silent. His lack of hearing had taught him how to walk without shifting his weight, without creaking a floorboard. Now, combined with the ability to hear his enemies, he was practically a ghost. He dispatched the first guard on the lower level with a swift, brutal strike to the carotid artery, catching the man before his body could hit the concrete floor. The second guard, stationed by the rusted control panel, met a similar fate, a suppressed double tap to the chest that sounded like nothing more than a heavy staple gun. Leo emerged onto the main kill floor. The space was lit by a single, harsh halogen work light powered by a generator. Beneath it, tied to a bolted metal chair, was Clara. Her face was bruised, her lips swollen, but her eyes snapped up with fierce, desperate recognition the moment Leo stepped into the light. Standing behind her, holding a heavy iron wrench, was Uncle Vincent, the treacherous interpreter, cowered by a stack of wooden pallets, gripping a shotgun with trembling hands. "Well, well," Vincent sneered, his voice echoing off the cavernous walls. "The deaf prince finally arrives. Drop the gun, Leo, or I cave her skull in right now." Leo stared at his uncle, his grey eyes colder than the Atlantic Ocean. He slowly lowered the Glock to the concrete floor and kicked it away. "Look at you," Vincent laughed, stepping out from behind Clara. 27 years I watched you wander around that estate like a broken dog. I almost felt pity for you. You poisoned me." Leo spoke. His voice was a guttural, raspy growl, tearing through vocal cords that had been dormant for nearly 3 decades. The sound of it made Alex flinch violently. Vincent's smile vanished, replaced by a look of genuine shock. "You really can speak. That brilliant idiot Dr. Hayes actually built the bypass." Vincent shook his head, pacing in front of Leo. "Yes. Leo, a localized thallium-based neurotoxin. I started slipping it into your formula when you were 6 months old. It scarred your eardrums permanently, but left the nerve intact. Your father was building an empire. and I couldn't let a strong, capable heir take what was rightfully mine. You were supposed to be a weak, pitied figurehead I could control. Clara struggled against her zip ties, her eyes fixed on Leo. "Keep him talking," she mouthed silently. "And Dr. Hayes?" Leo demanded, his rough voice echoing with authority. He figured it out during a routine scan. Vincent admitted, with a careless shrug. Threatened to tell Dominic. So, I had Lorenzo cut the brake lines on his Volvo. A tragic cliffside accident. Just like the tragic accident you and this maid are about to have. Vincent raised his gun, pointing it directly at Leo's chest. "Any last words, nephew? Since you're so fond of them now?" Leo didn't flinch. A dark, terrifying smirk slowly spread across his face. "Yeah," Leo rasped. "Look, behind you." Suddenly, the massive steel roll-up doors at the front of the slaughterhouse exploded off their tracks as two armored Russo Syndicate SUVs smashed through the barricades. Blinding headlights flooded the kill floor. Half a dozen heavily armed men poured out, but it was the man leading them who made Vincent drop his wrench in sheer, paralyzing terror. Dominic Russo stepped out of the lead vehicle, his shoulder bandaged, a massive Smith & Wesson revolver in his hand. His face was a mask of apocalyptic fury. Before leaving the estate, Leo had done exactly what he had forbidden Clara to do earlier. He had linked the Bluetooth transmitter of his bone conduction device to his father's private cell phone. Dominic had heard every single word of Vincent's confession broadcast in real time. "Dom." Vincent stammered, taking a step back, his gun wavering. "Dom, listen to me. It's a trick. Chicago set this up. I heard it all, you rat." Dominic roared, his voice shaking with the grief of a father betrayed. "You stole my son's life." Realizing he was trapped, Vincent panicked and swung his weapon toward Clara. But Leo was already moving. He drew a concealed, snub-nosed, .38 caliber revolver from his ankle holster in a blur of motion. He fired once. The bullet caught Vincent square in the chest. The treacherous underboss collapsed to the concrete, dead, before he even realized he had been hit. Alex dropped his shotgun and fell to his knees, sobbing and begging for mercy as Dominic's men swarmed him. Leo ignored the chaos. He rushed to Clara, dropping to his knees and pulling a tactical knife to slice through her thick plastic restraints. The moment her hands were free, she threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his chest. Leo wrapped his massive arms around her, burying his face in her hair. He closed his eyes, listening to the frantic, beautiful rhythm of her heartbeat vibrating against his chest. "I've got you," Leo whispered, his voice trembling but finding its strength. "You're safe. I've got you." 6 months later, the ocean breeze sweeping off the Rhode Island coast was warm and gentle. Leo stood on the balcony of the Russo master suite, looking out over the cliffs. He was no longer the brooding, isolated heir. With Vincent gone and Dominic stepping down into a quiet retirement, Leo had taken over the syndicate. He was restructuring the empire, turning blood money into legitimate real estate and logistics, ruling with an intelligence and precision that the underworld had never seen. The heavy glass door slid open behind him. Leo didn't need a transducer to hear it anymore. Thanks to Clara's father's journals, the top surgeons at Mass General Hospital had performed a groundbreaking reconstructive surgery, completely repairing the chemical scarring on his eardrums. The silence was gone forever. He turned around. Clara stood in the doorway, the morning sun catching the golden highlights in her hair. She wasn't wearing a maid's uniform. She wore a silk robe, a brilliant diamond glinting on her left ring finger. "You're up early, boss," Clara said, a playful smile on her lips. Leo walked over to her, pulling her flush against his chest. He looked down into her eyes, his thumb gently tracing her cheekbone. He leaned down, his lips brushing against her ear. "I just wanted to listen to the ocean," Leo murmured, his voice now deep, smooth and commanding. "But I'd rather listen to you." He captured her lips in a deep, passionate kiss, pulling her into the warmth of the room as the door slid shut behind them, sealing the outside world away. They had survived the silence. And now, the rest of their lives was a symphony they would write together. Did this explosive finale leave you on the edge of your seat? Leo and Clara's journey from silence to ruling the syndicate proves that true love and justice speaks louder than words. If you loved this thrilling mafia romance, hit that like button, drop a comment, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life inspired audio stories. See you next time.